Some of you probably saw this a few days ago. A new report came out that said California surpassed the United Kingdom as the world's 5th largest economy. So California is booming. I think that's really impressive that one state in the Union can actually have a larger economy than the United Kingdom. But despite the enormous wealth in our state, our schools are crumbling, our roads are filled with potholes, and calls to the police and fire often go unanswered. And one of the major reasons for this is the public pension costs in California, or what Warren Buffett calls it is a tapeworm in government budgets around the United States, but especially in California, that's consuming more and more of government budgets and leaving less and less for core government services. So before I continue, I want to kind of do a definitional part to my presentation so that we all know what we're talking about here. So tonight what I'm primarily going to be talking about is defined benefit pensions, which 90% of public employees in California receive a defined benefit pension. 3% of private sector workers in the United States receive defined benefit pensions. So that shows you, this is really, what we're talking about tonight is a phenomenon that basically it just applies to the government sector. Private companies long ago exited the defined benefit plans for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about later. But so basically now defined benefits are found only in the public sector for the most part. What we're not going to be talking about primarily is what's called defined contribution plans, or 401ks is what most people know them as. These are, the traditional pensions that people have in the private sector if they get one at all. Keep in mind, the majority of people in the private sector get no employment-based retirement plan at all, beyond, of course, Social Security. But if you do get one in the private sector, you're pretty much guaranteed that it's going to be a 401k, which is, as you know, you contribute, your employer contributes, and you can contribute as well. A small percentage, it's usually about 2 to 4% of your paycheck goes into a fund. Every paycheck that you control, you can have some say sometimes about how the money is invested, but it's under your name. You can take it with you. It's your property. It's your asset. But that's not what we're going to be talking about tonight, because that makes way too much sense for government, because it's very transparent and very fiscally responsible. So how are defined benefits calculated? How are the pensions calculated under a defined benefit plan? There's 3 factors: years of service, so how many years you were in the government sector, your age at retirement, and your final compensation. And you take those 3 numbers and you plug it into a formula, and that formula is based on the formula in place when you first got hired. So on day 1 that you were hired, whatever the formula was, that's the one you're going to have for the rest of your career. Or it can be improved, but it can't be reduced. So we're going to talk about that. But for example, a common formula is 2% at 55. So what does that mean? So that means for every year of service, you get 2% of your salary as a pension, and you can retire at age 55. So for example, let's say you work 30 years in government at 2%. So what does that turn out to be? That's 60% of your salary. Let's say your final salary was $100,000, so you would get $60,000 as a pension for the rest of your life. So what is the operating model of a defined benefit pension plan? It's actually really simple. So the pension systems, they collect the contributions from the employer and employee, they invest the contributions to generate earnings, and use the proceeds to pay the benefits to retirees. So it's pretty simple and straightforward. You collect the money, you invest the money in bonds, stocks, real estate, and you use the earnings from those investments to pay the benefits, again, that are based on that formula with 3 factors. So it seems really straightforward, and it seems like, Jerry Brown has called it basic arithmetic, which he's right. I mean, there's some complications, but it's not that complicated. So how did we get in this mess? It's politics and politicians. Because these plans are actually not that complicated if run responsibly, but unfortunately they're run by politicians, and that's how we got into this mess. So at last count, California had about 86 government-defined benefit pension plans covering 11% of the population. So a relatively small percentage of the population is having outsized effects on budgets throughout the state. The biggest, of course, most of you have heard of is CalPERS, which is actually the biggest government pension plan in the United States. CalSTRS, which covers teachers, and then the University of California Retirement Plan, which covers faculty and staff at UC campuses. So those are like the big three that I call them in my book, California Dreaming, available for purchase at the back of the building. So those are the big three. So what is the total unfunded debt of not only these three, but all other smaller public pension plans? You know, there's 86 roughly. If you do the math correctly, Stanford has some really good economists there who regularly update these numbers. It's at least $1 trillion of unfunded liabilities for the public pension systems in California at all levels of government, you know, state, local government. So it's a huge amount of money, obviously. And it varies by state. I mean, it depends on where you live. Some towns and cities and counties are in worse shape than others. So it varies from place to place, but overall, it's a huge burden not only on budgets, but also on the services that governments can render, which I'm going to get into later. So how did we get into this mess? So I came up with something called the formula for failure, which explains, I think in a nutshell, how we got into this mess. So first is generous benefits, and I'm going to get in a little bit more detail for each one of these. So generous benefits plus lowballed contributions, so we're underfunding, overpromising, underfunding. We're investing the money in risky investments that often go bad, and no surprise, that results in massive debts or what's called unfunded liabilities in the pension world. So that's how we got here. But I think it's important to point out right away that politicians face perverse incentives to mismanage these plans, and it's not a Republican and Democrat thing. It's all politicians against the rest of us who are the tax-paying citizens. It's a bipartisan failure, so don't think your guy's a good guy and the other guy's a bad guy. If you look at voting across all states on bills to increase public pension benefits across all 50 states, Republicans and Democrats both voted over 90% of the time to increase the benefits. I think Democrats were like 98% and Republicans were like 92, 93%. So if you think that difference is enough, you can say rah, rah, Republicans, but they're all playing the same game. And the game is that formula for failure, overpromise and underfund. So let's look at the benefits first in terms of overly generous benefits or generous benefits. Are they high in California? They are. California ranks third highest in the country. If you look apples to apples, if you look at the average full career miscellaneous government retiree in California, their pension is about $65,000 a year. So in present value terms, that's $1.2 million that they have to look forward to receiving. The average full career safety retiree, so this is fire and police, they're $85,000 per year is the average pension. Again, this is full career, with a present value of $1.9 million that they can expect to receive at the time they retire. I don't know about you, but I don't know that many people in California that have a nest egg that large when they retire of 1.2 to 1.9 million. It's not an exaggeration to say that government employees in California, after a full career, retire as pension millionaires. But nationally, the nest egg, the median in the United States is about $65,000. So I think this is what really ticks people off, is that your average person who's paying for these benefits can never expect to attain the pensions that these people are getting in the public sector. And I think that's what really makes people angry when they see the unfairness between somebody who's paying into the system, who's going to retire with $65,000 in the bank versus government employees with $1.2 to $2 million pensions that they can expect to get. The average first month pension check between 1999 and 2012 doubled. So we're in a period of rapid escalation of pension benefits. About 30% of that increase, that doubling over the last few years, is due to one bill, SB 400, which I'm going to talk about. So I'm just going to give you a brief history of the benefit side. CalPERS was started in 1932, and at that time, benefits were moderate, reasonable. 1.43% was that factor. It's called the benefit factor, and you could retire at 65. So it was, modest pensions, but over time, you can see what's happening. The benefit factor went up from 1.43 to 1.67, and in 1945 and 1968, they added automatic COLAs. In 1970, it became 2% at 60. So they reduced the retirement age and they increased the benefit factor. So you can see what's going on. Politicians are making greater and greater promises to beneficiaries. And of course, the beneficiaries love it. Their families love it. The unions love it. They contribute because their benefits are being improved. But this is a ticking time bomb. Everybody, well, I'm going to mention the next one in 1999, which is SB 400, which really broke the bank for the pension plan. So it went to 2% at 55. So now you could retire, instead of 65 when the plan started, retirement age was dropped to 55 for rank and file, and for CHP it was dropped to 50. So it's 3% at 50. So for example, you work 30 years and retire at 50, you can get 90% of your final salary for the rest of your life. And what also is happening during this whole time period, life expectancy is going up. So they're not making sufficient contributions to anticipate the growth in life expectancy, which also is hurting the solvency of these plans. But so SB 400, the vote on this, which really broke the bank for the pension plans, was 107 to 9, or 109 to 7. Only 7 votes against, unanimous in the Senate, so it was bipartisan vote. And CalPERS testified on behalf of this bill, which is actually pretty rare, but they said SB 400 won't cost taxpayers a dime. So they promised that the increasing returns in the stock market would pay for this benefit increase. The other thing is, in many cases, they made this benefit retroactive to the date that people were first hired. So they not only increased it going forward, but they allowed them to take advantage of it and apply it going backward. So again, nobody was making contributions in anticipation of this huge spike in benefits. So right away, immediately it shot a hole in the pension plan. So the cost, instead of not costing a dime, it's actually going to cost more than $10 billion. And Gray Davis signed the bill, and he later said in an interview, he said, "We got the math wrong big time," he said. So yeah, no lie. They were way off in their actuarial estimates of how this impact was going. And then there was one more increase in 2001, 3% at 60 for local government employees. So it kept getting more and more generous over time. So let's look at, so that's the benefit side. As you can see, there's this natural proclivity on the part of politicians to keep increasing the benefits. And then on the investment side and on the contribution side, there's an incentive to lowball the contributions. So if you look at investments over time, at first they were really restricted in terms of what they could invest in. In 1932, when it was formed, they were bound by law to invest only in low-risk U.S. and municipal bonds. So it was very risky investments that they could make, or risk-free investments that they could make. Over time, 1947, they allowed investments in utilities, which back then was pretty riskless too because they were all regulated at that point. 1953, they added real estate, so then they could start speculating in real estate. 1967, common stocks were added with a 25% cap to the portfolio. They could only have 25% stocks. But in 1984, voters did it to themselves because they passed Prop 21, which removed the cap on stocks. So they could go all into risky stock investments, real estate, anything they wanted to, basically. And as a result, they've taken some big hits over time because they get into things that they're not all that equipped to invest in. And so the increased riskiness of the portfolio, and because it's risky, though, they make very outlandish estimates about how much they're going to earn. For example, the common last few years have been 7.5% return is what they've been expecting. To put that in perspective, Warren Buffett for Berkshire Hathaway has a defined benefit plan, and they assume a 6% return. So CalPERS is saying that they're going to outperform Warren Buffett by 25% in perpetuity, which is pretty hard to believe, right? So, but that gives you an idea. I mean, that kind of puts it in perspective. They always assume really high rates of return because they keep making more risky investments over time. And they do that because they're lowballing the contributions, which I'm going to get into next. So they only put in typically about 75 to 85% of what they should do, not only to cover the annual cost of the pension plan, but also to pay down the debt that's been accumulated. You want to do that in a reasonable amount of time. I mean, most standards, best practices would be like 15 to 20 years you want to pay down the debt. They use more like 30 on up, but they're not even paying in enough money to close the gap that they currently have, so they get ever behind. It's like having a credit card, and not paying the minimum amount, and then the balance just keeps growing, and that's what we're having in the pension plan. But so they're, for example, CalSTRS underpaid by more than $11 billion in a recent 5-year period. The University of California retirement plan had a 20-year pension contribution holiday. Don't you love that word, holiday? So for 20 years, the UC system and the employees didn't pay a penny into the pension plan. So it went from overly funded, it was like 137%, something like that, funded, so they had more than enough assets to cover their liabilities. And then they took a holiday on our dime, because now we're making up the difference, and also the students. So they took a holiday for 20 years, didn't pay in anything, and so it went from more than enough money in it to, it's somewhere between $11 to $15 billion deficit now. So again, that shows you, and they do this when the stock market is roaring along. They use that as an excuse then to either increase benefits or reduce the contributions. So you can never get ahead in that type of arrangement, because even when the stock market is performing well, they're doing all these other things then to unsettle the system. Average contribution rates, you remember when I talked about 401ks, they tend to be about 2 to 4% that an employer puts in. So the average contribution rate in California for miscellaneous workers is about 25 to 35%. For police and fire, it's 30 to 50% of salaries. So for example, you pay a salary, let's say, of $2,000, you have to put in another $1,000, another 50% for police and fire pension. So it's a huge additional cost to local governments. San Jose Police and Fire, they reach at 1.70% of salary was their contribution rate. Contribution rates throughout California are going up. The prediction is over the next 7 years about a 50% increase in contribution rates. Up until about 2013, they expect, or 2030, they expect about another doubling of contribution rates. So this is why when you open up the newspaper or go online, I don't know if anybody gets a newspaper anymore, but when you go online, there's constant, no matter what city you're looking at, they're complaining about the increase in their contribution rates to CalPERS, and they're showing up at CalPERS meetings and saying, you know, this is unaffordable, but we can't cut anymore, we're as lean as we can get. And you know, the reason for that is mismanagement of these plans for decades. Again, contrast, you know, these contribution rates with the 2 to 4% that private employers pay for employees' retirement benefits, if they offer them at all. So this formula for failure, so what are the problems it creates? I mean, one is, you know, this huge debt that we're facing today of unfunded liabilities, which I mentioned was about $1 trillion in California. Overall, nationally, it's about $3.5 trillion to $4 trillion. And keep in mind, this is money that should be in the bank today to pay for benefits already earned for work done in the past. This doesn't even factor in the future. As I mentioned, I mean, they're not putting in enough money, so every single day you fall further and further behind unless you make a killing in the stock market, which they keep hoping they will. But at $1 trillion unfunded liability for California, that's about $25,000 for each man, woman, and child in California. That you have a price tag on your head right now of that amount that's going to have to be paid off unless you move to another state, or we make some, you know, serious changes here in California. The other reason why you should care about this problem is not just the debt that you're taking on, but also service delivery crowd out. I mean, this money is taking money away from, you know, schools, fire, police, you know, you name it. Library hours are cut back. Parks are not being maintained. The worst case scenario, of course, is Detroit, which went into bankruptcy largely over unaffordable pension promises. When they went into bankruptcy, they owed $18 billion in liabilities. Half of that, $9 billion, was for pensions and retirement. They went into bankruptcy. They finally got a workout of it. And as a result, the judge in that case said that you could reduce pension checks for current retirees. So, and they went ahead and did that. They cut it by about 4.5%, I believe. So people who are currently retired, counting on that money being there, probably made plans their whole life, knowing or believing that that money would be there, saw a reduction in their pension checks. So that's how bad it can be. I mean, that was the first time ever that a judge said, okay, it's all right to go after pension checks and reduce those for current retirees. And the judge in Stockton said the same thing. So that's how bad it can be. But I think it was also a wake-up call to people who are retired or just about to retire, that they're not safe anymore. If these systems go under, you know, if your local government goes bankrupt because they can't afford pensions and other costs, they can come after your pensions now. So I think it's a wake-up call for all of us to figure out a way to fix this system. And the third reason why you should care is, I don't see a lot of kids here tonight, but the reason is, I mean, it's immoral to shift this debt onto younger people. Thank you. I mean, it's unfair to saddle youth with this debt that they had absolutely nothing to do with creating. You know, we're pushing the cost onto our kids and grandkids, and you know, basically we're using kids as their piggy banks, and we're certainly doing with the UC system, where they're increasing tuition, and a lot of that money is going to pay off the unfunded liability after the adults took a holiday. And the other reason you should care in terms of the unfairness or immorality of the system is not just the intergenerational transfer, but it's what I mentioned earlier. I mean, taxpayers with average salaries, modest pensions, if at all, are being asked to pay ever-increasing taxes for what I consider to be overly generous pension benefits that they could never hope to attain on their own. And I didn't even get into the horror stories. I mean, I talked about averages, but I mean, there are incredible stories. The former president of the UC system, 7 years as president, is collecting over $350,000 pension for just 7 years, 2 of which he wasn't president, really. He took a sabbatical for 1 year, and then he taught the 7th year. And there was a recent story in the New York Times about Oregon, which could be almost as bad or if not worse than us, but there was a recipient there, a former government employee. He's getting a $912,000 a year pension, $76,000 a month. So, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that really makes people angry, and rightfully so. Okay, so what do we do about this? So, reform recommendations. In my book, did I mention it's available at the back of the room to purchase? Did I say that? So I talk about 8 reforms that could be done or need to be done. So I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. So reform number 1, honest accounting of the true extent of the unfunded liabilities. I mean, there's been a lot of shenanigans where, politicians and officials try to hide the burden on the public or hide the burden from the public. So that's number 1. Stanford University is doing a great job, their economists there, of actually calculating using the correct methodology what the true unfunded liability is. They have something called Pension Tracker. So go on that website if you want to find out what it is in your area. I don't know if they have every area yet, but they're working on it. But it's a great first step to try to figure out what the liability is in your area. I think it should be on Zillow or one of these house buying websites. Like if you're going to buy a house in this area, they should let you know what your household debt expected unfunded liability is. I mean, I think it would be honest and helpful. I think it would, it would force people to really turn out and, ask their politicians to do something about it. The other one is 100% funding to the ARC each year, which, they changed the terminology a bit, but essentially what it means is, if you're in a hole, stop digging. So pay what you need to pay, no matter what plan you have, a DC plan or DB, defined contribution, defined benefit, pay what you need to pay it down. At least the problem isn't getting worse. So there's normal cost, which is the annual cost that you have to pay in for that year's pension obligations earned, and then there's the unfunded liability that needs to be paid down over. I prefer quickly so that you're not shoving the costs onto the younger people, but at least set up a schedule where you're going to pay off this debt in X number of years if you adhere to this payment plan. The other one is require a 50-50 split or cost sharing for new hires, at least, for new hires. But essentially what that says, whatever that cost is, that new hires should pay half of it. Because the way it is now, the unfunded liability portion, the employees are protected from that. They don't pay any of that. They just pay whatever is negotiated in the labor agreement. They don't pay anything to pay down the debt. So they really have no incentive to pressure these pension plans to manage these funds responsibly, because ultimately it gets pushed onto the taxpayer if there's an unfunded liability. So I think a 50-50 split would really create a huge incentive there for the members themselves, who are going to be the beneficiaries ultimately of these plans, to really provide oversight and make sure these plans are managed responsibly. So the 50-50 split was in the 2013 bill that Brown led the fight for, and so for new hires going forward, that split is there, but I think it would be better if we could apply it somehow going retroactively as well, but that's a problem which I'll talk about actually next. So the next one is abolish the California rule. So this is a rule that's unique to 13 states, California being one of them, that says whatever that formula was on the day you first took took a job in the public sector, you're guaranteed that formula going forward. They can improve it, but they can't diminish it unless they give you an offsetting benefit. So it guarantees you this, this amount, no matter how long you work and no matter how long you live, and it can't be adjusted downward. It resulted from, I think it was a 1957 California Supreme Court case that established, it's basically an interpretation of the contract clause of the California Constitution. It's not a rule, it's not a law, it's just an interpretation by the Supreme Court that the Constitution was originally, the contract clause of the Constitution was originally established to not impair contracts, and that the government couldn't impair contracts, and that this was a contractual relationship. The benefit formula was between the employee and the employer, and it's been pretty much for 60 years consistently applied in California. So what that does is it prevents local governments, state governments from modifying pension benefits for current workers going forward. Not going backwards, but going forward. So you can't modify that original formula going forward, even for work that is yet to be done. It can't be changed prospectively. But there's a court cases that I'm going to talk about at the end that hopefully will leave you a bit optimistic. But that's one item that's really important, really crucial, is to modify or abolish this rule, because it really puts local governments especially, but also state government in this fiscal straitjacket that they can't get out of. They can't solve their own problems if the economy goes down, or if benefits are tinkered with at the state level. You're kind of stuck with some of this at the local level, so it really hurts local government the most. And the other one, important reform is require voter approval of any pension benefit increases. Voters should have the final say. I mean, we're ultimately on the hook for these unfunded liabilities, so if anybody proposes an increase and it's approved by the legislature, I think that voters ultimately should have a say in whether or not this goes forward. There's some charter cities in California that allow or actually require a vote on pension increases. San Francisco is one of them. And so, I mean, I think it's worked well in San Francisco and other cities. At least some of them have avoided some of the excesses in terms of problems that other jurisdictions have, because voters have, and it's been fairly consistent. I mean, they oftentimes vote these things down. So I think that's really important, to empower the voters and let them have the final say about what the benefit structure will be. Another one, ban retroactive benefit increases. I mean, that's kind of like a no-brainer, but that's vitally important, because that's what SB 400 did, and it really harm the state going forward in terms of its fiscal situation. And another one would be final, but I think besides abolish the California rule, this would be like the second most important, would be switch to 401k plans going forward for state workers. And some states have done this already, so this has happened elsewhere. But what this would do is you could use the savings, by making the switch, you could use the savings that pay off the existing pension debt faster. It helps limit cuts to basic public services. It helps limit future tax increases. It reduces the burden on future generations. You never have an unfunded liability in the future, always fully funded. You make it mandatory that every paycheck they have to put in that 2 to 4% or whatever. It could control costs, especially if you add on this voter empowerment provision. It's transparent. It's very easy to figure out. It's easier to budget, right? You just take total salary multiplied by whatever the percentage rate is, you got the payment. I mean, it's really simple for not only the public to keep track of, but for budgeting and legislators and politicians to figure out what the burden will be. And it's also easier to project future budget impacts, because you just have to look at like the growth of government employees over time, the growth of salaries. I mean, it's much easier to do. I mean, the current system is so complicated. There's so many tiers, so many benefit factors, so many different ages of retirement. It's so complicated, and nobody, unless you have a PhD in economics and spend all of your life doing this, I mean, you can't really figure it out. But that's what the politicians love about it. They can do all of the shenanigans behind the scenes, and people don't follow it. They don't know what's going on, and until the whole thing blows up in their face, which is what we're experiencing today. So I think a 401k approach would be transparent, simple, straightforward, easy to keep track of, easy to hold people accountable. And we're starting to see a movement towards that around the country, and even in California, and this is why you should leave optimistic. So my last page here, reasons to be optimistic. Oh, one other thing about a 401k is it puts employees in the driver's seat regarding investment decisions to some extent. I mean, there's usually a few choices you can make in terms of how your 401k is invested, but it gives you some control over risk, the mix of stocks in your portfolio. If you hate tobacco and oil and you love solar, you could kind of shift your portfolio to favor that. And it also is a better option for modern workers. My dad worked for the same company for 40 years in Minneapolis. So, I mean, people don't do that much anymore. I mean, they like to jump around. And a 401k, it's very easy to show in the math, and I have it in the book, where younger people who change jobs more frequently, the 401k is actually a much better plan for them. The old-fashioned defined benefit plans are good if you're going to stay a long time. They're backloaded in terms of the benefits, so the longer you stay, the better it increases at an increasing rate type of thing. But if you want to change jobs and you want flexibility, the 401k is actually a good plan because you can take that money with you. It's yours, and it's under your name immediately. So those are the reasons why I think a 401k is the best approach. In the book, I talk about what the savings would be. I calculated it at $6 billion a year for the state of California, just the state of California CalPERS alone. I mean, that's a huge saving. And that money could be used then to pay down the existing debt, which is happening actually. And so these are the three reasons to be optimistic and not cry your way to your car. So number one, Janus, the Supreme Court case, that the decision is going to come out probably late June. This was a government employee, works for the state of Illinois, lives in Springfield, doesn't want to have to pay agency fees anymore to his union, similar to the Fredericks case. So he, challenged it in court. Now it's with the Supreme Court. They heard the case. The decision should come out at close, probably near the last couple decisions. They always hold the best to last. So it'll probably be end of June, early July. But essentially the impact it could have if he wins is that it could cut significantly union membership and union revenue and thus union political power. So it's a First Amendment case. He doesn't want to have to pay for union representation. He disagrees what they're doing, not just in terms of the political side, but also in terms of the bargaining, the economic side, because he says, as well as Frederick said, that everything's political that a union does, because if they take more money, for example, for pensions, it leaves less for education and for housing or for roads or schools or whatever. So it's a political act, and there's no greater political document for every state than their budget, and it's annual. And so he's saying you can't separate the two. You can't put bargaining on one end and political endorsements of candidates or something on the other end. It's all one thing. It's all political speech, ultimately. I think he's right, and hopefully he'll win. And that would then allow you, you could opt out. You wouldn't have to pay anything to a union if you don't want to. You wouldn't have to become a member. You don't have to pay agency fees. You don't have to pay anything. And it would also force unions to actually respond to their customers, right? And if you want their help, you have to go out there and earn it, type of thing. Two, the second reason to be optimistic. So there's two California Supreme Court cases that are currently in the system that are a direct threat to the California rule. One is out of Marin County, one is out of Contra Costa County. But essentially, the question in both cases is, can pension benefits, as we talked about, can pension benefits be modified for current government workers going forward without providing an offsetting benefit? Lower courts said that it can. So they took it, both of these cases, I think they've been consolidated into one case because the question is essentially the same. So is it a guarantee? Do you get a pension guarantee at the day one that you're hired? Is that guaranteed to you? Or is it a benefit that can be modified based on conditions going forward, like Social Security is. Social Security isn't a guarantee. I mean, it can be adjusted and has been adjusted. And so should it be thought of more as like Social Security, or should it be thought of as a contractual agreement that can never be modified, even for work that hasn't been performed? That's the key. So Governor Brown argued forcefully for allowing modifications in a brief to the California Supreme Court. I couldn't have written it any better. So Brown is clearly on the side of allowing for modifications going forward of pension benefits for current workers. And he also has telegraphed a win. He said in the papers that he has sources that indicate that it will go our way. So it wouldn't necessarily, you don't have to reduce any pension benefits. If your city is doing well and you're not facing a crisis, you can just leave them the way they are, but at least it will allow you to renegotiate the pensions going forward for cities that are truly in distress. And when 20% or more of a city's revenues go to pensions, they get serious about either reforming pensions or declaring bankruptcy. It's estimated that 10% of California cities by 2024 will be at 21% or higher. So they'll be over that threshold, that rule of thumb that around the country usually triggers either bankruptcy or serious pension reform. But how can you do serious pension reform in California unless you abolish the California rule? So if we don't, I mean, we're looking at massive bankruptcies in the state going forward. Vallejo, Stockton, San Bernardino are nothing compared, I think, to what we're going to see unless we can modify the California rule. Third reason not to cry when you're walking to your car is UC, the University of California system, in 2016, they offered now an option. New hires can receive a 401k plan, or they can choose a defined benefit plan. And you think, well, everybody's going to choose a defined benefit plan. It's so much better. But as I mentioned, it's not better for the younger people today who want to switch jobs more. It turns out 1/3 of all new hires in the last cycle picked the defined contribution 401k plan. So I mean, that's really optimistic. I think to think that when people are given a choice, they actually will choose oftentimes the 401k approach. And the savings that's expected for the UC system by these people, this 1/3, and well, this is 1/3 this cycle, but every cycle there's new hires. So savings, $99 million a year, and they're using 57% of the savings to pay down the debt. So that's exactly what I was talking about earlier. If you switch to the 401k, you can use the savings and to pay down the debt that you've already accumulated, and it provides all those other good benefits of not having to cut basic core government services as much, not having to increase taxes as much, hopefully, or hold the line on it, not having to shift. Most important to me is not shifting the burden on the future generations, which I just consider completely immoral. And so there's all these benefits if you switch to the 401k and use the savings to pay down the debt. I'll finish with this last point. To all of you, don't let a crisis go to waste, okay? This is actually a perfect opportunity to think about the virtues and speak about the virtues of privatization and shrinking the size of government, right? If we extract all of these activities that are under threat from pensions, out of the public sector and move them to the private sector, we don't have to worry about this debt. The employees won't be there, the programs won't be there, they'll be done in the private sector. So the more that we can transfer activities out of the public sector and move them to the private sector, the less that this problem will also matter going forward, especially for our kids and grandkids. Thank you.
We have a few questions, and we'll start. Well, we've heard a lot about California. Can you name a state in which public sector employee pensions are well managed and well funded?
No.
Who does it? Oh, my.
No. No, I mean, pretty much across the board, they're underfunded. I mean, some are better, some are worse, but I mean, the problem is across the country because the politicians act like politicians, right? I mean, they're just doing what's in their best interest. But there are states, Alaska, Michigan, I believe Michigan, that have transitioned more and more towards the 401k. So they were the models actually that I used for my book and then applied it to California. So there are a few states that are making the transition over. It's slow. Most of them, it seems like when they transition, they go to like a hybrid where they have a mixture. They have kind of a defined benefit aspect to it that's kind of minimal, a floor. And then on top of that, they allow you to participate in a 401k. So it's kind of a hybrid system, which is, I mean, it's not that bad. The problem is, though, if you keep any of that defined benefit around, it could blow up in your face going forward without a whole lot of oversight by the public. And again, I mean, it's really hard for the public to monitor these things. And, you know, they have busy lives. They just don't track pensions. So the answer to the question, yeah, there's a few states that are at least moving in the right direction. But across the board, every state has an unfunded liability. California happens to be one of the worst in terms of absolute size of the debt.
Thank you. One of the arguments defending generous retirement plans for public employees is that they're paid less than the private sector employees. Is that true?
No, it's not true. I have a part in the book that compares apple to apples and government employees both in terms of salaries. Sometimes it's fairly comparable, but in terms of benefits, vacation, sick pay, and pensions, it's much more generous in the public sector. So overall, I think it's like a 30 to 40% increase. Basically, and this is apple to apple, the same job in the private sector versus the same job in the public sector, it's about a 30 to 40% increase.
Well, I think almost every other person in this group wrote a question, so we won't get all of them, but we'll move fast as we can. This is great, though. There's a lot of good interest. Okay, upon retirement, if one moves out of the U.S., Social Security payments are reduced. If a California state employee moves out of the state, are their pension payments reduced as well?
I don't think so. No. I mean, I haven't heard that's true. So I would say no, but don't act on this. Consult.
Don't move yet.
Consult your attorney or your tax accountant. But I don't think they are reduced. Somebody's thinking of moving where? Mexico or? No? Yes?
Okay. All right, so this scheme, someone has, in our audience had called this a Ponzi, like a Ponzi scheme or close to it. Are there no way to hold anyone legally or morally responsible? Well, morally we know we can only do so much, but...
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. Like if a public pension defined benefit plan is managed correctly, there should be no intergenerational wealth transfer. I mean, you shouldn't need more young people to come into the system to pay for the benefits that older people, retired people are receiving. Right now, in like CalPERS, for example, about all of the money that comes in annually goes out the door immediately to pay benefit. So it's as close to a Ponzi scheme as you can get because you keep having to bring people in to pay off what's already owed, and you're hoping to make a killing on what's already invested to pay down this debt. So, I mean, it's a crazy system. It's gotten as close to a Ponzi scheme as possible. At least with a Ponzi scheme, though, I remember a professor saying this to me, like, you can choose to participate or not, but like Social Security, you can't. And this one, in a way, you can't either if you're a taxpayer, right? I mean, you're stuck holding the debt that's going to have to be paid for if you're going to make good on all the promises that have been made. So, yeah, it is very close to a Ponzi scheme. That's how bad it's gotten.
Kind of related to the question of Social Security, do public employees pay into Social Security? And if they don't, do they receive Social Security payments?
Some do, some don't. I mean, most teachers, I think, in California don't receive Social Security, right? I think so. Yeah, so they're relying on, you know, the pensions that they receive.
So that's probably what they would tell us in that way.
Right.
Are citizens of other states going to be on the hook for this? Of course, the old bailouts.
And one
Or
thing I
finish
should
up
mention
on-
in my plan, excuse me, but well, yeah,
Sure.
but I need to mention that in my plan in the book, I mean, we're making good on the promises that were made. I don't want to, for work already done, and people should receive what, you know, the promise was. It's only going forward, I think, where you should be able to make adjustments if needed. Sorry. What
Yeah,
was-
the question was on bailouts. You know, with people in other states at some point, if California declares bankruptcy or...
Well, I mean, that is one of the fears, is that this has become so pervasive around the country that I could see, you know, somebody proposing a federal bailout. And again, remember I mentioned it's $3.5 to $4 trillion unfunded liability for all of these plans around the country. So, you know, if we do that, we're looking at, you know, a huge entitlement, new entitlement program for the states created by the federal government to pay off this debt. I mean, I hope we don't go there. I know Bernie Sanders proposed it for that Central States plan that's failing, a bailout. So there is already talk about stepping in and bailing out specific plans. So I wouldn't, you know, say it's impossible that somebody's going to propose it. It's such a massive amount, though, but, you know, that never stops the federal government, right? So they'd just print the money and say, here. But, so, I mean, it's possible. I mean, obviously, I'm against it. I mean, I think if you created the plan, you should figure out how to fix it and solve the problem, because it really lessens the burdens, you know, so much that there's no reason then to fix any of this. If you just bail them out, they'll just keep the plans in place the way they are. So it's a terrible disincentive to get them to act. The only reason why we're acting here is because it's reached a point where we can't ignore it anymore. And so that's the upside of having a crisis. But it usually, unfortunately, you know, it usually takes it to get to that point before people act on it.
Okay. The next question deals with the term double dipping, which I think is when you retire, you get a pension, and then you go get another job, and that coupled with survivor benefits, would you think this might be part of the reason for the high cost of housing in this area with lots of public employees? And
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, it adds to the income that people have to afford to pay for homes. Yeah, I mean, one thing is, I mean, the high capital gains tax, right? I mean, it locks a lot of people in the housing that they probably would sell and get out of the area, but they're looking at such a huge capital gains tax on it that they just stick around. That's probably more to do with, that probably creates more house lock in the area than anything. But yeah, the pension system, you know, it's a huge huge income for a lot of people that probably bids up the cost of housing in the area.
so,
Especially in the Sacramento area, right? Because there's so many government employees. And
sure. On the topic of unfunded liabilities, what in the doomsday? What if they don't get paid? What happens?
well, at the local level, I mean, there would be bankruptcy. I mean, that's what would happen. And we've seen what happens, you know, in Stockton, Vallejo, San Bernardino. I mean, it can be worked out. In Detroit, the pensioners took a haircut, a little clipping, but not that great. But although they did lose, a lot of them lost their health insurance, which was a bigger hit probably than losing the pensions by 4.5%. At the state level, well, I mean, technically, I don't think states can go bankrupt, so I don't think that's available as an option. So I don't know. I mean, no state that I know has ever walked away from it. They could. That nothing prevents them, but I mean, politicians doing what they do, I probably can't see that happening. What they'll do is what they've been doing is cutting back other services and increasing taxes to pay for it, or fees. In the case of University of California and other student tuition, that sort of thing, they've been increasing that and using the proceeds to pay for the pensions. So yeah, I can't see the state of California walking away from this. I mean, I think what hopefully will happen is we'll win in the California Supreme Court, and that will give us the flexibility then to modify where pensions need to be modified in the worst case areas going forward, and hopefully, reduce that debt and make some sort of switch to a much more sane pension plan. In my opinion, it would be the 401k, something like that.
I don't know if this is a nightmare scenario or is this actually it's been in the wind. What if the state of California would take a portion of proceeds from home sales to go for the unfunded liabilities? How much can they grab?
No, don't give them any ideas. Hopefully there's no politicians here from Sacramento. Yeah, I mean,
Had you heard that, or is that?
I haven't heard that, no.
Oh, that's good.
No, I haven't heard that as an actual proposal, but let's just keep this in this room here. And that's
just a
something they
hypothetical.
could do. I mean, well, it's
yeah.
something they definitely could do. Like a tax on real estate
Yeah.
sales, something like that, yeah.
Let's see what you get there. Okay, could you explain the 457 rule, and is that what happened at UCSF? I don't know what that is, but or the 457?
I'd have to have that question explained if
Oh,
somebody
okay.
wants to.
All right.
Talk to me afterwards.
Too esoteric, yeah.
Yeah.
If you ever ask that, you
Okay.
Ah,
So is that the one I just talked about?
yeah, I think that's,
Okay, well, that must be what I just talked about. I didn't know that lingo. Okay. I'm for it.
yeah.
Well, I think she was saying that 457 is a 401k for the UC system. So I think it's what
There
I
you
was
go.
talking about earlier.
Right. Well, I'm glad that it's at least have its own little code, so maybe people are signing up for it and they like it.
1/3 did in the last cycle, so it's
That's
popular.
not bad. That's
In
not
fact,
bad.
the unions, if I could talk about that a little bit,
Sure.
the unions complained that the 401k was actually too generous, because they didn't want people actually using it. They wanted it there, but they didn't want people choosing it. So they complained a lot that the terms of the 401k were too generous. So yeah, that shows you where they're coming from.
All right. And then jumping back to the UC system, the UC top administrative salaries are like $1 million plus. Are there any considerations to bring them into fiscal reality? Or they think,
Well, there is a cap now. The pensionable part of a salary is only, I think, $117,000 in the UC system. So they did, as part of this 401k reform. Oh, janitor. So it's just water. So as part of this 401k reform, they also put in place a cap on how much of a salary is actually pensionable, which probably was a response to the UDOF, President UDOF thing, because it was outrageous. $357,000 a year he gets in pension after only 7 years in office. So I think that things like that propelled them to actually make a change in that direction. And that also applies to the 2013 PEPRA reform that Jerry Brown pushed. They put in a cap too in terms of how much of your salary can actually be used in that formula to calculate your pension.
we'll just do a couple more, get on to the books and your book signing. This is sort of theoretical. What can financially conscious millennials do to lift us out of this crisis?
Well, I mean, I think they can get active and involved because they're the ones who are ultimately going to pay this bill as it gets pushed off onto younger generations. So I think the most important thing is they can get involved and to say, hey, there is an alternative to this. We don't have to keep making this mountain ever greater, and here's a plan that we can do it. So it all takes, getting involved and caring about the issue. And as you guys all do, I mean, I thank you so much for coming out, because it's a very important issue that a whole lot of people don't pay a lot of attention to until it blows up in your face, and that's where we're at today. But it's very encouraging to see that, you guys are all out here paying attention and becoming informed, and I think together we can really make a difference. There is reason to be optimistic. The U.S. Supreme Court case, the California Supreme Court cases, the UC change, we're changing in the right direction. It's slow, but it could move very rapidly in a few months.
What a great segue. The question was, if someone was to approach a specific politician, what's a good way to open this whole topic about unfunded liabilities and pensions? And
well, I mean, it depends on where you live, but you might have a really good example right out in your neighborhood of something that was cut back and because of pension costs. In Oregon, there was a Three Rivers school district where the school was literally cut off from the community because of a mudslide. And so the principal called the Public Works and said, can you come out here and clear this mud off the road? And he said, well, we have the trucks, but we don't have the gasoline, and because the money went into the pensions. And there was a house across from a fire station in San Jose that burned down in 2013 because the fire station, the fire trucks were mothballed, again, because pension costs were consuming the budget rather than going into core government services. A few years ago, the Oakland Police Department posted on their website 44 crimes they would no longer respond to because 80 officers were let go to use that money to put it into the pension plan. So when you're sacrificing or threatening public safety to pay for pensions, I think we've hit a moral tipping point. So I think if you can find examples like that in your community and use them, I think those are really persuasive to everybody, including politicians.
well, when those court cases go the right way a few months from now, you can say, you heard it here, you heard it first. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.